Okay, hi everybody. It's really nice to be here. Thank you very much indeed, Juliet, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be along and to be sharing your day and to be exploring learning, which is one of my favourite things to do. And as Juliet said, I don't home educate anymore because our children have grown up and gone off to do other things. Is that okay? Can you hear me? Thank you. Oh, I hate these things. Our children have grown up and gone off to do other things, but the fascination of being at home with them and being part of that journey really hasn't left me. So started off as a home educator. And while we were home educating, I kind of ran some academic interests in home education and in learning alongside that. And I worked with Alan Thomas at the Institute of Education. And that kind of led me on to doing a PhD, which was on children learning to read at home. And then from there, I'm now a lecturer in early childhood at Liverpool Hope University, and I am still really engaged and exercised over some of those questions of learning that set me off on this trajectory in the first place. So I thought today I'd kind of like to take you on a bit of a journey of my explorations, of my thinking, and the things that have bothered me and exercised my mind over this in the spirit of exploring learning. But also in the spirit, I think, of empowering us to think about things a bit differently, to question some of the things that perhaps need to be questioned about education and about thinking around learning. So, have I got a slide? Oh my God. Doesn't matter. There we go. Okay. So it all started off for me with our own children, as it does for lots of us. I've got 3 children. They're quite close together in age. And I think when our elder daughter was about 3, sort of well before she got to 5 and school age, I'd found out about home education. And I just came across it really quite casually, but I was really excited when I did. And I started thinking, wow, this could be something really great for our family. And my reasoning behind that wasn't so much educational. It was just that we're having a nice time at home. You're at home with 3 little children, and I'm sure everybody knows all the fun that you get up to and how interesting life is. And I didn't really want that to stop just because she was going to turn 5. So that was kind of our rationale for moving into home education. And I suppose that somewhere at the back of my mind, there was a bit of an elephant in the room that at some point I was going to have to get serious and start thinking about education and not just having a nice time with children. I mean, I'm not a teacher. I don't have a background in education. So I didn't have that kind of thing to fall back on or to influence me. And back in those days, I used to read everything, I still do. Read everything that I can get my hands on about home education. And I belong to Education Otherwise, and I remember in those early days reading a couple of accounts in the newsletters there that parents had written in about children learning to read at home. And in these accounts, it seemed that children just spontaneously started to read. These were accounts of children who hadn't been taught, but who had somehow picked up reading for themselves and had just begun reading on their own. And I was amazed by these stories. I thought, wow, that's incredible. That's absolutely incredible. And I thought, how cool would that be if that happened in your house? You wouldn't have to bother with lessons and resources and practicing things and putting time aside. You just do what you do, and then one day turn around and your child can read. And so, bowled over as I was by those stories, I didn't actually think that they had anything very much to do with us and our experiences in our house. And I kind of boxed them off and thinking, yeah, that's absolutely amazing, but those are exceptional children. And that's the exception. And one day we're going to have to face up to the real business of learning to read. So our elder daughter, she was a bit of a dream child to learn to home educate on, particularly when it came to reading, because she liked books, she liked being read to. She liked sitting with the book, and she'd have the book in her lap and she'd turn over the pages and tell herself a story as she went along. Sometimes she wanted to write something down, and then she'd get me to write it and she'd copy it. She'd been able to recognize her own name since she was, about 2 or 3. So I knew that kind of very low-key things were happening in the literacy department. And as I say, I had no personal motivation to try and up the ante on that. We're just going with the flow here and just enjoying being at home and being together, and they're still really young. And And then something happened. Our elder daughter, it's just, can you still hear me? It's kind of got an echo now. Is that all right? Is it okay? Yeah, fine, I'll just carry on. She got given a book. And what usually happened in our house was that the children and I would go off to the library or maybe a bookshop, and we'd all look at the books together, and then we'd choose a selection of things that looked interesting. But there was always the implicit intention there that I was going to read the books to the children. That was always the way it worked. But this book came into the house, came in as a gift directly to her with the intention attached to it that this was a book that she was going to read for herself. And the book was a Dr. Seuss book. It was Hop on Pop. It's a really simple Dr. Seuss reader. And she took this book, she took it away, she didn't bring it to me, she went off and read it. And as far as I knew, she had never read anything apart from her own name before. So it was a very simple book, but I still found this absolutely mind-blowing. She didn't ask me any questions. She didn't read it to me. She didn't ask for any help. She loved that book. She carried it around with her for weeks, and it used to pop up in the garden and in the car and in the bathroom, and it was everywhere with her, and she constantly had her nose in it. And then after a few weeks, she'd had enough of it, put it back on the bookshelf, got herself out something different to read, and went off and read that. And that was it. She could read. And I was absolutely blown away. When I think about it now, I still get that same feeling. I was just, knocked me down with a feather. I could not get my head around what had happened. And there were two things about it that really bugged me. And the first was that in our culture, in our educational culture, learning to read is set up as such a huge thing, as such a colossal thing for children to do. It's broken down into myriad sub-skills. You have to have a vast array of knowledge about phonetic sounds and words and blending things together, and it has to be carefully cultivated and properly taught over a number of years to get children reading in the way that we want them to read. And I couldn't, and I thought, given all of that, how can she have worked it out for herself? How could she have worked out that big pile of stuff for herself? And compounding that was the fact that I had not noticed that anything was going on. And I was with her, like you are when you home educate, I was with her all the time, and I knew virtually on a minute-by-minute basis what she did with her time. And yet I had had no inkling that this supposedly seismic shift in her learning was going on. No inkling at all. So I had these two questions, and as I say, they really burnt into my brain. I couldn't stop thinking about these things. I couldn't stop thinking about how did I miss it, and what exactly is it that I missed? And I was working with Alan Thomas at the time, doing a project on informal learning, and that had touched on learning to read, and I thought, right, this is what I need to do now. I need to really get out there and do some research. I need to find out properly what's happened to other people and what the experiences of other home educating families are. I took that in to form the basis of my PhD research. So Alan Thomas and I had a website together at the time, and I put a questionnaire up on the website, 11 questions, and pretty basic questions about children learning to read at home. And then I went and advertised my questionnaire everywhere I could, so newsletters and events like this one and various contacts that I had, and encouraged people to come and fill out my questionnaire. And that went really well. I'll move on to the next slide. It went really, really well. 311 questionnaires, a beautiful round number that I was just so delighted with, 400 children altogether. That was just by chance, but it was a serendipitous chance. I really liked that number. And I'd made it clear when I went encouraging people to fill out this questionnaire that I wasn't looking for any particular kind of experience. I wasn't looking for a particular kind of home education. I didn't mind who filled out the questionnaire. The only criteria was that they had had a child learn to read at home. One of the amazing things about the data that came back, incredible data, but one of the really good things about it was that a whole range of home educators joined in the research. So we had religiously motivated home educators, we had philosophically and pedagogically motivated home educators, we had families like our own who just kind of drifted into it, and we had families who had never expected to home educate and had taken children out of school, really as the last option that they felt was available to them. And in some of those instances, learning to read had been a factor in that decision to take children out. We had marvellous array of approaches to reading. So we had people who were ardent phonics advocates. We had people who said, don't touch phonics, don't go near them. We had people who'd sort of delved into slightly more obscure methods like Doman Teach Your Baby to Read and Steiner methodology. We had families who'd made up their own methods and their own ways of going ahead. And we had families who said, we didn't do anything, we didn't actually even think about it. So we had huge diversity. And we also had a really wide age range of children learning to read, everywhere from 18 months to 16 years. And this data, when you're doing research, questionnaires have got a bit of a reputation of being quite a perfunctory way of going about finding out about things, because you know it's like when you get a questionnaire and you really can't be bothered to, so you've got these tick boxes, they don't really show what I think, and so you tend not to get back very rich data, and you can't ask people open-ended questions because nobody wants to give up their time to writing loads and loads on a questionnaire. And this research kind of quite confounded that image of don't research through a questionnaire, because it felt to me, when these questionnaires came in, it felt to me like I'd opened a floodgate. It was amazing. People wrote their hearts out. People wrote pages. And sometimes people were looking back on things that had happened, maybe 10 years previously. But it was like everybody has got a story to tell about this thing. Everybody has got something that they want to say about learning to read. So it was really rich data. There was loads and loads of it, and it was really rich data. So I was exploring this, reading through this, trying to get my head around what these people were telling me. And at the same time, I had these two questions that had set me off starting. How had she managed to do it by herself, and how come I hadn't noticed it? I had those two questions burning away at the back of my mind. And as I got into the work, I kind of realized that before I could start to answer those questions, I would need to go a layer deeper, and I would need to start thinking about my thinking and why it was that I'd asked those questions, and what kind of an answer I thought I might get for those questions, and what the foundations of my own thinking were. And I realized that if I didn't do that, if I didn't start exploring learning on that level, I would not be able to get to the heart of what I wanted to get to. So I'm going to read you a tiny bit out of my PhD, don't be too scared, in which I tried to express, this was part of my conclusion, and I tried to express that feeling. And this is what I wrote. I put, I watched my 5-year-old daughter begin reading, apparently spontaneously, and I didn't understand what I saw. I was eaten up with curiosity, and I asked a question. How did she do that? And how couldn't I have asked it? In this spirit, I began my PhD, seeming in those days to be asking a simple question and believing that its simplicity would stand in my favour, no matter how complicated the answer might turn out to be. And yet before long, I had to begin to consider how I'd ever come to ask such a question. Why are some things questions and other things aren't? Why do some people ask them and other people don't? And why do some ideas work as answers and other ideas don't? And I've come to see that the fount of questions as being not in the nature of the things they're about, nor in the attributes of those who do the asking, but in the configuration of events and ideas that form the space of the asking. So it's impossible to ask how children learn to read away from the understandings that we already have about children, about reading, about learning, and about the nature of reality. Nor can we ask it away from the political and social ways in which we act out those understandings every day of our lives. But even more significantly, without particular views on these things, there would be nothing to ask. So what I want to do today is kind of take you on some of my thinking, some of the exploring that I've tried to do about my thinking, about learning, and the things that have impeded me from answering the questions that I wanted to ask, and preferably to answer, but I still don't know that I've got to that point. So I'm going to run some ideas by you about metaphors, about symbols, about time and space, and about freedom. So quite a hefty list. And start off with the idea of metaphors. So usually when we think about metaphors, we think about sort of literary embellishments that novelists and poets use in their work to, I don't know, bring things more alive to us, make their work more vivid for us. But the academic study of metaphors is quite different. The academic study of metaphors suggests that our metaphorical understanding is very deeply embedded in the way that we look at the world around us, the way that we understand the world around us, and that those metaphors, the metaphors that we use, set us up in terms of how we relate to the reality around us. And I read the work of two Americans called George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, who've written extensively about metaphorical meanings. And their argument is that if we have an abstract concept like friendship or sadness or faith or learning, we can't get that out and empirically look at it. We can't measure it. We can't weigh it. We can't smell it. We can't prod it around. We have to approach it in different ways. And their argument is that this way is almost always metaphorical. So then I turned to the work of an educational philosopher called Anna Svard, who's also really into metaphors. And her argument was that learning has been dominated by one huge metaphor for centuries now, and that's the way that we have come to understand learning, and because of that, it's the metaphor that has been used in education. It is so deeply entrenched that we don't particularly recognize it as a metaphor at all. It informs our policy, it informs our practice, it's all around us. And that's the metaphor of learning as acquisition. Because we can't get hold of learning, because we can't examine it empirically, we use the metaphor of learning something is acquiring it. And we use it, it drips through our language, and once you start looking for it, it's everywhere. And I listen to myself talk and I think, oh, there's another one, because I use it all the time myself. It's the discourse that's around us. So when we talk about grasping something or getting something or internalizing something, taking possession of skills, mastering something, they are all entailments of this metaphor of acquisition. We've got two cartoons there that sort of, highlight that kind of meaning. I know the one that comes up in home education a lot about, not filling the bucket. We're not here filling buckets, that metaphor of acquisition. And the other one sort of throwing things at a child and seeing what sticks, because that's a way of that child acquiring that knowledge. Oh, beg pardon. Oh, so they're just notes, really. So is it the writing or the cartoon? The first one, the top one just says the student's mind's a dartboard and the teacher chucks sharp objects in its general direction to see what sticks. So if it sticks, you've acquired it. If it falls off again, then you have to try again. And the other one's the bucket metaphor, with the teacher filling up the student's head. So, and this metaphor, Svard argues, it goes across huge differences in education. So everything, we might kind of recognize this when we're thinking of a teacher standing at the front and children, writing down notes from a board or reciting things by rote. We might think, yep, that's the acquisition metaphor at work. But equally, she says this metaphor is at play, is behind our understanding when we think about co-construction of knowledge, children participating, and sort of cycles of investigation and working things out. And we're still using that metaphor of acquisition in terms of how we understand learning taking place. And it's kind of like if you only have one metaphor, it's very difficult to understand that is a metaphor, because it just seems so common sense. Well, yeah, of course that's what learning is. Of course that's what it's about. So it wasn't until about the 1980s, 1990s that a different idea was put forward. And it was put forward by people like Barbara Rogoff, who's a socioculturist and has looked at learning and growing up in other cultures a lot, and Laban Wenger and their communities of practice, if anybody's heard of those. And an author called Frank Smith, who wrote about learning to read, about children learning to read. And their metaphor was a metaphor of participation. So learning is not actually about acquiring things for yourself. Learning is about being able to join in with other people when they do things. And Laban Wenger's example is based on apprenticeships, and they say at the beginning, the the new apprentice kind of stands on the edge and doesn't do very much, and then they're gradually drawn into the practice of the experts. And their learning is not about them personally acquiring knowledge, it's about them being able to participate. And that participation will lead to a level of expertise for them. And Frank Schmitt, he interestingly wrote about literacy, and he talked about children joining the literacy club. He didn't talk about phonics skills and letter sound combinations and blends and those sorts of things that are usually talked about around learning to read. He talked about children joining the literacy club, and that what he meant by that was that they joined in the literacy lives of their communities. So, for example, the first time that a child points to a sign and says, "What does that say?" They're literate, they are joining in, that is their participation in the literary community. Our daughter, with the book on her lap, turning over the pages, she was participating in the literary community, and it's that participation that he says was important. So I thought it would be really interesting to look across all this data and see what kind of metaphors the home educators used. So there were lots of acquisition metaphors, because there always are, because as I say, it's it drips through our language, it drips through our speak. But there were also some really interesting participation metaphors, and they seem to come about sort of really spontaneously. People talk particularly about their children who didn't read, presumably couldn't read, but who nevertheless had rich literate lives, who were involved in books and stories in all sorts of ways and joining in literate activities in their household. So they were talking about participation in those things, which is a bit of a reversal of how we usually approach literacy in schools, where the idea is that children will learn to read, and once they've learned to read, then they will be able to move on to read the book that interests them or to join in the activity of which literacy is part. Those home educating families were showing actually it doesn't need to be that way round. You can be joining in the activity, and that's what's important. It doesn't rest on the fact that you can read at all, let alone at a particular level. But they also used some other metaphors, and the one I thought that we would look at today is the metaphor of osmosis. So that's a bit of a fuzzy picture of Garfield. The idea of learning by osmosis isn't exactly new. There's kind of that idea that if you tie enough erudite volumes to your person, some of that wisdom will seep into you. Or, you know, when you've got that big exam coming up tomorrow and you know that you are in no way prepared for it, you put the book under your pillow and go to sleep, and some of that might just seep into your brain and do you a favour in the morning. But when the home educators talked about osmosis, they didn't talk about it like that. They were very serious about it. And that made me go and look. I'm not a biologist. It made me go and look at, well, what exactly is osmosis then? And as I understand it, and I'll be really happy if anybody wants to correct me, osmosis is the passage of molecules from a weaker solution into a stronger solution through a semi-permeable membrane, through a kind of filter, so that you get an equilibrium on both sides of that solution. And using that as a metaphor for learning, it's got some really interesting entailments. So for a start, it's a natural process. Nobody is in control of this. Nobody is managing it. It happens because of a particular configuration, a particular setup. And it'll either happen or not happen, depending on that setup. It can't be managed or controlled. Another thing about it is that it happens involuntary. You don't get to decide whether these molecules are going to do their stuff or not. It doesn't happen because somebody is motivated and making it happen. And that's quite a big thing to say, because we talk a lot about children's motivation and children being motivated and the amount of effort that we expect children to put into what is basically for them a very low reward activity, learning to read. Certainly I remember looking at our son when he came to learn to read, and it required so much effort for him to read something really simple when he had loads of other interesting things to do. Why would you, Tom, why would you bother? So that was another entailment of it. And another thing that I thought was really interesting is, in the osmosis metaphor, everything changes. In the acquisition one, where the teacher's pouring the liquid into the bucket head, all that changes is the child, the learner, the person who's supposedly receiving this knowledge. Nothing else changes. But in the osmosis metaphor, everything changes, both sides change. And I thought that was a really good reflection. It resonated with me, I think, about how home education affects everybody, about how your child's learning affects everything that goes on in your house. And it's not an activity that your child does. It's something that's really interwoven and interdependent. So that's a quick look at metaphors. And I'm going to move on to symbols now. And symbols and metaphors in lots of ways. They have parallels between them, and we can go about thinking about them in somewhat of the same way. So I started academic life as a social anthropologist, so I was big time into symbols, and so education's a great place to be because it's full of symbols, and we've got everything from, you know, those smiley face stickers and the gold stars up through all the letters and numbers, combinations of grades and all the certificates that you get, and the letters after your name and the special clothes and the kind of the rituals, the graduation rituals, and so on. So it's a really rich symbolic field. And like the metaphors, the problem is that the symbols start to overtake the thing that they're symbolizing. And you're looking at the symbols and you're not thinking what is behind the symbols, what does this symbol actually stand for? You're thinking that this symbol itself has its own meaning. And so it just seems like a no-brainer argument, a completely futile, obstinate argument. Of course, somebody who's got a first-class degree knows their subject better than the person with the second-class degree. Of course, the child who comes home every week from school with 10 out of 10 in their spelling test is brighter than the child who flunks it every week, or at the very least is a better speller. Of course, the teenager who's got 13 GCSEs is in a different intellectual league to the teenager who's got 2 GCSEs, and it just seems a waste of time to dispute those things. They seem like facts, but they're facts based on symbols. So I've got a quote up there. I don't know if you can read the quote. I will read it to you. It says, "Society's confusion between the thing and symbol is perhaps the greatest entrenched illusion of the Western education system." And that was written in a paper by Peam and Flint. Nick Peam was my supervisor for my PhD at Birmingham. And he was not a home educator, but he was incredibly critical of what he called the ontotheology of education. So a lot of our symbols in education are used in terms of measurement and measuring children's learning. And so I thought it would be really interesting to look at what replaced those symbols, or what went on instead of those symbols in home education, or whether those symbols or other symbols were used. So, because symbols are usually used to measure, and I was thinking about home-educated children, and we know that children at school in the UK are subjected to batteries of tests, probably more than any other children in the world, and that home-educated children, while some of them do take tests and lots of them go on to take public exams, their educational environment is not the test-driven environment that it usually is in schools. So how do home educators know that their children are learning? And came up with 3 things. Can you read those? Are you able to read? Oh, okay, great. All right. They're just examples. So there were 3 strategies that home educators used. And the first one was observation. They could see when their child had learned something. And that really resonated with me because I remembered my daughter with the Hop on Pop book, and she didn't read it to me. She didn't read it out loud. She didn't ask for my help, but I knew that she was reading it. I could see that the way that she engaged with that book was different to the way that she had ever engaged with a book before, and I was able to see that that was because she was reading it. And so it was really great for me that I found other parents who said the same thing, like the mother who said there, he was looking at a joke book, and I realized that he was reading it. So parents observed what their children could do. And sometimes they observed what their children didn't do, which was really interesting as well. So one mum said that her son liked to play with game cards, like Pokemon cards. And he used to bring the cards to her and ask her to read them to him. And then he stopped coming. He was still playing the games, but he stopped coming and asking her to read. So she said, I knew he was reading them for himself then. So one of the other ways was demonstration. Children demonstrated what they could do, and sometimes they deliberately demonstrated what they could do, as in one little boy who came to his mum and said, look, I can read this word, I can read this sentence, I can read this page, and was showing off what he could do deliberately to his mum. Sometimes it was a lot more casual than that, and children would kind of incidentally demonstrate what they could do. So I think that's a little bit like the one there about reading the labels on the cross-section of the fish at the zoo. And I remember that, can remember those days at the zoo, you know, they're so busy, there's so much to look at, there's so much to explore, there's so much to talk about. And a tiny little part of that day is that you look at a cross-section of a fish and read out part of it. He demonstrated what he could do. Another mum told me, this was a really good one, they had a series of books which all looked the same, but they had the titles on the spine, and the books were in the bookshelf. And she watched her daughter go down the line of the books that all looked the same apart from the lettering on the spines, and say the name of the title that she wanted and take the book out of the bookcase as she did so. So she had demonstrated that she was reading, she could identify that title. Another way was self-reporting. Children self-reported what they could do. So they told their parents. So that boy there, they were halfway through the reading scheme, and he said to his mum, "We can stop doing this now, I can read." And it turned out that, yes, he could. And there were other children who did that as well, who said to their parents, "I can read now." One mum, she said her daughter was 10, and she said she was carrying a book around, and so her mum said to her, "What's that?" And she said, "Oh, that's the book that I read at the weekend." So she just self-reported for herself, "I can read." And one parent actually said, "We don't really know how much our son can read, but he tells us that he's learning, and that's good enough for us." So he checked in and said, "Yeah, I'm doing this thing, it's okay." And that was really interesting for me, because yesterday I went to a workshop at the university that was all to do with assessment, and how do we assess students, and how do we stop them cheating, and how do we make sure that there is parity in their assessments, and all that, and all these big things around assessments. And nobody once suggested you could ask them what they've learned. So that was the self-reporting. So we're going to move on now. What are we doing for time? Move on from that one to one that kind of brings together metaphors and symbols together. And this is my thinking around learning trajectories, and particularly the learning curve. And this is my thinking about time and space as well, and where I pull those things into thinking about learning. So the idea of the learning curve, it's a very familiar idea. Again, it's a metaphor, it's embedded in our thinking. It seems to us a bit of a no-brainer that if you want to learn something, you start off at whatever is considered the easy end of that thing that you want to learn, and then you devote some time to it, and as you devote that time to it, you will get better and better at it. So my first issue with the learning curve is to do with that time axis along the bottom, and thinking about this idea of dividing time up into units like that. So I don't know that, whether it's days or whether it's hours or maybe it's lesson times, and putting those on an axis like that, suggesting that time is always having the same value. So even if we took a really formal situation, like say we said, we'll do 3 hours of geography a week, would we really be saying that those 3 hours have the same kind of value? Would part of those hours maybe might be spent doing something completely new that we might think is learning? Part of it might be spent talking about something that we did last week. We're not sure if that's the same level of learning or not. Some of it might be kind of periphery things like looking for your pencils. That's probably not learning. But along that timeline, we're giving time a structure. And when we think about time and young children, I think that's particularly problematic, because we know that as adults, we don't always experience time in the same way. Time can go really quickly or it can go really slowly, but we know that for children, that subjective feeling of time is probably more important to them than the measurement of time, the objective measurement of time. So I do remember one little boy saying to me once that he had been 3 for about 100 years. So it's a subjective idea. His subjective idea of time was quite different. His experience of time was quite different. So I think if we're thinking about time in children's learning, we need to think about that aspect of it, that time doesn't always mean the same thing, and it certainly doesn't always mean the same thing to children. And I've got some issues with the vertical axis as well, because our usual corollary of time is space. It's not progress. And yet in the learning curve, like some kind of sleight of hand, we're talking about progress as if progress was space. And that's kind of compounded by that kind of the curve and and the area underneath the curve that somehow seems to signify what a person has learned. And that kind of plays into that metaphor of acquisition, because the longer you go on, the more there is of it, like acquiring something. So I've got some philosophical issues with the learning curve. That notwithstanding, this is how some families describe their children learning to read. That, they started off with, sort of basic things, and then they moved up and a little bit in the next level and the next level after that. And they talked about that kind of progress. But other families talked about completely different kinds of progress. And here's a selection of different kinds of progress. So the one on the top left up there, the incremental incline. People talked about learning happening in fits and starts, children making a beginning and then leaving it, going off and doing other things, coming back to it at a later stage. And that might be because they got bored with it, they did a little bit and then they just didn't want to do any more. Or it might be because they'd hit a difficulty and the difficulty made them give up. And one of the interesting things about it was that very often that parents described that when children came back, they'd have a break, and sometimes that break would be weeks, sometimes it would be months, in some cases it was years. But when they came back to it, they were always a little bit better than they had been before. And that was really interesting, because one of the big educational worries is about backsliding over the summer holidays, and the children have this long break in the summer, and that means that when they go back to school in September, they can't remember what they were doing. And certainly in the university as well, people worry that people have just done their A-levels and they're kind of on the top of their game in their subject, and then a few months go by and they turn up at university having forgotten all that stuff. And it's actually, talked about very seriously as being, a worry and something that we have to do something about. And these parents were describing the opposite. So one mum said that her son had started learning with one-syllable words, and he was getting on really well with them. So they upped the game to two-syllable words, and he found that really difficult and didn't want to do it anymore. So they just stopped reading altogether. A few months later, they picked it up again, and the two-syllable words weren't a problem. Somebody else said that their son had started learning, I think he was about 5, and he'd made a little bit of progress, could read some simple words, and then he'd lost interest, and he lost interest for 5 years. But when he came back, when he was 10, he told his parents that he didn't want them to read his Beano to him any longer because he was going to do it himself. So that was the incremental incline. And then there was the downward curve. And the downward curve really takes dispute with that hard, easy designation on the standard learning curve. The idea that you start off at the point that's easy and then things get progressively harder, because that depends on how you're going to designate something as easy, how you're going to decide whether it's easy or hard. So in reading, we usually say that easy reading are short phonetic words, and difficult reading is long, irregular, non-phonetic words, which is fine if you're learning through phonics. And I've got no truck with phonics. Lots of people said to me that phonics had worked really well for their children. But equally, in the research, there were lots of families who hadn't used phonics. And then that designation of hard and easy doesn't make sense. So there were parents who were saying things. One mum said that her son could read words like bungalow and exit and dinosaur, but he couldn't read words like and so and cat. So he was very competent with what we consider to be difficult words, but struggling, not able or not interested in reading what we would think of as being the simple words. Somebody else said to me that her daughter was a poster child for asynchronous learning. She said this is typical of her. She will always go for what we think are the higher concepts before going back and filling in detail lower down. And lots of children started reading, when they began reading with what we would generally consider to be really high-level text. So Lord of the Rings was the first book that one child read. Several children, the first book that they read was a Harry Potter book. So starting at a level that we would consider to be impossible for a beginner reader, but that was where they were choosing to begin. So those kind of experiences broke up the idea of there is a starting place, a general starting place when you're learning something, whether it's reading or something else, that beginners need to begin at this point, because there were so many different points which muddled up the designation of hard and easy. And then there was the non-progressive line, and this was kind of like, I think, what I would have drawn for our daughter. These were families where they said, don't really know how our children learned to read. It happened so fast, there was nothing to see. There was no progress, they couldn't do it, and then they could. And some people talked about, it happened overnight. Other people talked about light bulbs flashing on and switches clicking and children bursting into literacy. So loads of nice metaphors about how suddenly, how quickly this thing had happened, and just sort of going from nowhere to being a competent reader. And then the last one, the scribble. There were people who described scribble processes, but not to the extent that people were saying we're going round and round in circles and our child's just not learning. Nobody actually said that. The scribble was more me thinking about, what am I learning here? When I'm looking at all this data and I'm looking at my questions and I'm thinking about metaphors and symbols and learning curves, what am I actually learning here? Am I going somewhere with this? Am I making progress? Could I put this on a curve? Or is it that, you sort of push out a little bit one way and then you push out a little bit another way and you're not sure how those things connect and you keep on going? And that kind of resonated with me, that's actually what it feels like when you're learning something. You're not on some kind of, train track going to a destination that when you get there that says you are now able to do such and such. You are much more in that exploring zone where you're not sure how this is going to pan out. You're not sure what's going to be at the finish of it. And then I started thinking, when we think about reading, and I'd been doing this all the way through the research, thinking about whether children could read or couldn't read. Why was I thinking about it in terms of there is an end point to this? What's wrong with thinking that we will all go on continuing to learn to read all of our lives? We will keep on progressing in some way through this. So that one was kind of there for me, for my own ruminations. And so finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about freedom. And when I went into the research, I had very much, as I say, I had sort of some binary ideas, I think, now when I look back on them. And one of the binary ideas was about teaching and not teaching. And I thought, when I get these questionnaire returns back, I'll be able to identify families who've taught their children to read and families who say they haven't taught their children to read. And the research will kind of fall into two halves like that. When it came back again, the picture was much more complicated. So there were people who were really happy to say that they taught their children to read, and there were other people who said, no, we didn't teach them to read. But there were a lot of people in the middle who were saying, well, what do you mean when you say teach? And I'm not sure whether I taught her or not. I did a lot of things with her. Does that count? And other people who said, well, yeah, I tried to teach him, but that's not how he learned. So there was a big grey area in the middle, and I could see the ends of my spectrum kind of collapsing in on each other, thinking about teaching and thinking about structure in learning. So I think one of the things that my exploration, my thinking about this has taken me to is to try and reconfigure how I understood that idea of teaching and not teaching, of structure and autonomy, and to try and think of this as more of a space. And I think that was how a lot of the home educating families used that space. They were very flexible, very changeable. People described doing different things with different children. They described beginning things and then deciding that it wasn't for them, or it wasn't working out how they hoped to, or seeing something else that caught their attention and changing and going and doing something different. And they talked about a lot of dynamics, and children themselves were very, going back to that osmosis metaphor, children themselves were very much involved in the shift of dynamics. So people who had thought that they would teach their children to read, and one mum said, I was really excited about it. I'd got all the Steiner resources lined up and everything, and then their children didn't want it. No, thank you. So she didn't. And at the other end, there were people who said, intended to be quite hands-off, and then found that their children were coming to them and wanted to do things with them and were asking them to join in activities, or just coming to them with lots of questions, and the parents were being drawn into that process. So there was a lot of flexibility. And the other thing about it was time and things changing over time and families adapting and changing over time. And a lot of negotiation, working out together what they were going to do and how they were going to do it. So that kind of brings me to the end of my whistle stop. Juliet waving at me, great. That kind of brings me to the end of my whistle stop tour of some of the things that I've done in my own exploring of reading, and which have opened up my ideas about what education might be, or some of the possibilities for education. So I really hope it's resonated. I did bring a couple of copies of the book with me today if anybody wants them. Yeah, just come and ask me. My PhD, if anybody wants to look at that, you can look at for free. It's in the Birmingham University of Birmingham e-thesis repository. So you just Google my name and Rethinking Learning to Read, and you can get straight onto the PhD. And one of the things that I did feel doing this work was that beyond all the thinking around it, there is a huge resource here. 311 families, 400 children. There is a huge resource here for people who have got children at home, who want to know more about reading, who want to know what happens in other families when children learn to read, and that we should make good use of that resource. And I'm also not at the end of my questions and my explorations about this thing. I'm really happy if anybody wants to get in touch with me and wants to talk about them, or wants to talk about learning, or wants to share experiences about reading, then it's always absolutely brilliant to hear from people. So please don't hesitate to get in touch. And thank you very much.